Hello, everyone, and welcome to Neurocracy. Today, we're joined by Dr. Lauren Hartstein, an assistant professor of psychiatry at the University of Arizona College of Medicine. She's a developmental sleep and circadian rhythm researcher who studies how evening light exposure, including light from screens and media, as well as other environmental factors, can affect children's circadian systems. Dr. Hartstein, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So, my first question for you is what originally drew you to sleep?
Interestingly, I didn't come into sleep as my main focus for my graduate work.
Yeah.
I was studying child development and cognitive development, looking at how executive function emerges in preschoolers. When I was introduced to some work about how light exposure during the day in an office setting affects people's performance and their cognition. And so we wanted to look at how light during the day affected cognition in young children, thinking about the school setting. And then after I graduated, I was actually giving a presentation about that work at a conference when somebody came up to me and told me about a postdoc opportunity with Monique LeBourgeois, who was going to study how light exposure at night affected sleep in the same age group. And so it kind of seemed like a natural jump from light exposure during the day to light exposure at night and its effect on sleep. And then once I started to learn about sleep, it's the most interesting thing, and I don't
Yeah.
want to do anything else.
Yeah, I agree. So, could you elaborate a little bit on some of your work and some of your research in terms of light exposure and interestingly, like how it relates to schools and offices?
Yeah, so it wasn't a ton of work, but we mainly found that exposure to brighter, bluer light during the day, so a higher correlated color temperature, more stimulating to those specialized eye receptors that are also associated with sleep and circadian rhythms, resulted in better performance on some measures of executive function. So the ability to switch between tasks quicker was improved based on the light, as well as called inhibitory control. So basically, the ability to not just automatically do the same thing you've been doing over and over again, recognize that there's a right and a wrong answer, and kind of inhibit that automatic response. In children as young as 4 years old. And so
Wow.
clearly that system comes online from an early age. And then looking at light exposure at night and sleep, we were looking at how light exposure in the hour before bedtime suppresses the body's production of melatonin, which is the hormone that helps the body transition to sleep, and whether it pushes the timing of the clock later. So we know in
Yeah.
adults, the system is very sensitive to light, it moves it later, it can make it harder to fall asleep. And we would expect that children would be more sensitive to light than adults. And we found that preschoolers were extremely sensitive to
Yeah.
light
Okay.
across all brightnesses, even to dim light.
Yeah. So I'm curious. So I'm aware that like light can be used sometimes to maybe like push back the like time in which people fall asleep. Is there any like strategic ways to use it in a way that maybe someone could be encouraged to sleep earlier, like their body could be primed to sleep at an earlier time?
Yeah, so we know it really depends on what time you're getting the light exposure. So light exposure at night pushes everything later, but light
Yeah.
exposure in the morning actually moves everything earlier. And so
Okay.
somebody who's trying to move their bedtime earlier, if you get bright exposure, particularly outdoor light exposure first thing in the morning, it's a really strong cue to the body about what time it is. And so it will allow you to get tired earlier in the evening, your body clock moves earlier, and to be able to maybe align with an earlier bedtime, which is really helpful also for kids who have to go to bed
Yeah.
at a certain amount of time to get up for school.
Yeah. And I mean, the main thing that comes to my mind, and the reason like this has been brought up in previous interviews, is because of school start times and how they're super early, especially for my school, which starts at 7:30 a.m. And a huge topic here is how teenagers, their biological clocks are often pushed back about like 2 hours. So it's always interesting to see how like light could maybe play a role in like for teenagers to strategically try to alleviate that when they're not able to change the time. So
Yeah, so
yeah,
there's a lot of recommendations even for teenagers to try to not get so much light exposure before bed, staying
yeah,
off
oh
media
yeah,
devices. But on top of that, we're understanding a lot more about the role of daytime light. So getting a lot of bright light during the day, there's some work in adults that shows it actually makes you less sensitive to the negative effects of light at night. So, if you have to use your phone before
okay.
bed or something, getting a lot of light during the day will still make such strong signals to the clock that it's not really disrupted by the effects of light at night.
Oh, is that maybe like partially due to like adaptation or like in terms of like being exposed to it longer, maybe like some other mechanisms or
Yeah, I don't know if it's adaptation of anything to the eye. I think it's more that it like the timing of the clock gets such a strong signal, and so then the weaker signal of the little bit of light at night isn't going to be as disruptive to it. So, it's
okay.
really set to the right time from all that really strong signal during the day.
Yeah. So, I believe like when you're saying like morning light exposure, you're talking about like outdoor like sunlight. So, what if someone, or I mean, I guess you can correct me on that, but what if someone like only has access to like artificial lighting or like their room lighting, like the ring
Yeah.
light that is actually currently in front of me? So, I'm just curious how like that can like maybe work differently or in a different mechanism.
So in an ideal scenario, outdoor bright light would be the best because just, even the brightest lights in your home are going to be much dimmer than what you get just from walking outside. And so, you want as much light as possible. But of course, there are people who live in places where it's still really dark in the morning or places where it
Right.
might not be safe to go outside. And so just as much as you can. So just getting bright light, we say circadian stimulating light. And so looking at, in terms of spectrum, something with a little bit more blue light is going to be a little more stimulating to the system. But just getting as strong of a signal from that light exposure in the morning as you can, and then minimizing light exposure before bed is kind of the balance of bright days and dark nights that's always recommended.
Yeah. So coming back to the topic of like teenagers and schools and youth. So I believe you've done like some research in terms of media and the use of screens before like bedtimes. I was curious if you could maybe talk about like some of your work relating to that and what you're finding there.
Yeah, so it's a really hot topic in the field right now because for
Yeah.
years everybody's been saying, oh, the blue light from screens, it's really damaging to sleep. And I think we're starting to slowly realize that that's maybe not the main reason that screens are disruptive to sleep.
Oh,
So we have all these studies in the lab where you're in the dark for several days and everything's completely controlled. And we can show that, yes, getting exposure to screens or that blue light at night then can be disruptive for sleep. But out in the real world, where you're getting bright light during the day, your device is maybe not so bright that it would be in the lab, you also have lights on in the room, the light from the screens is maybe not going to be such a disruptor.
oh,
And so we're kind of shifting from this idea that light definitely from screens affects sleep and more that maybe it could, but it not necessarily will in all real world scenarios. But there's a stronger emphasis being placed on the role of the content. And so I was part of a National Sleep Foundation panel a couple years ago that
okay.
reviewed all of the literature and came to the
Wow.
conclusion that the content of screens can be disruptive for children and adolescents for their sleep. So, watching a rerun of The Office for the thousandth time that you know what's going to happen, it's
That's funny.
soothing to you, it's not suspenseful. That could be something that would maybe be a little less disruptive to sleep instead of watching something that's really scary or suspenseful or reading a really
Right.
stressful news article before bed. And so also thinking about ways that you can use screens responsibly to kind of minimize that arousal to help yourself be able to fall asleep.
Yeah. So, for high school students like myself, right? So we're like constantly surrounded by devices and access to this like media that you're talking about. Do you have any like advice in terms of ways to like control this? Maybe like just I guess just general advice. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. A lot of it's addicting. It's easy to kind of
Yeah.
lose yourself and
Yeah.
lose track of time. One thing that I personally do is there are lighting software, lighting filters like Night Shift on an iPhone that you can
Yeah.
kind of set. So it's supposed to make the screen dimmer and redder because of the idea that it minimizes the blue light. And so we're not sure if blue light itself is the culprit, but I still like to use it so that at a certain time my screen starts to get really dim and red. And it kind of
Yeah.
is just like a mental trigger to me that, oh, hey, it's probably getting late. I should put this down because I realize that it's getting late at night. So just kind
Yeah.
of a way of interrupting that easy ability to just kind of keep staring at the device and getting lost in whatever you're doing. Trying to set alarms to step away from it. It's strongly recommended that people sleep with their phones in a separate location because it's also
Yeah.
after you put it down, it's easy for the alerts or the kind of the mental stimulation of getting up and going to the bathroom and checking the phone.
Yeah.
Taking that temptation away can be helpful for sleep.
Yeah. So, another thing I wanted to talk about is I believe you've studied like the use of melatonin in children. So I'm just curious, like what patterns have you observed and when and why parents give melatonin to kids, and how does that interact with like light exposure and sleep hygiene? So,
Yeah, so this was a big thing we noticed. Our lab previously only worked with healthy kids without sleep problems, and so there should be no reason they should be taking melatonin, right? And
right.
then all of a sudden in like 2022 after the pandemic, a lot of parents whose kids had no sleep problems were telling us that they were regularly taking melatonin. And
Uh,
so that inspired us to do a big survey to understand how many kids are taking melatonin and why. And so many, the prevalence of melatonin use in children has skyrocketed. So even 5% of preschoolers, 1 to 4, had been given it in the last 30 days.
wow.
And that jumped up to like 18 or 19% once kids started school, so age 5 to 13.
Wow.
Um,
Okay.
And I think there's a lot of reasons for this increase. I'm not sure if there's really clear evidence that sleep problems are necessarily increasing, but I think parents' awareness of sleep and its health impacts and kind of stressing more about their child's sleep have increased. And then just the availability of melatonin as a solution. Parents are clearly always desperate for solutions to help their kids sleep. When a
Right.
child is not sleeping, nobody in the family is sleeping. And
Yeah.
so when you go to the supermarket and every single thing on the kids' shelf is melatonin, 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 and it's heavily marketed as something that's, safe and easy for parents to use to help their child sleep.
Yeah.
But, it is a hormone that we're giving to children. It's not FDA regulated as a medication like it is in a lot of other countries. And I think while it's generally considered to be safe with minimal side effects in the short term for children, I think there's some concerns about not addressing what might be causing a sleep problem by just giving melatonin. Instead of maybe seeing a doctor, trying to figure out why your child's having sleep problems, just giving them
Yeah.
medication. And then teaching young children that when they can't sleep, they just take a medication instead of learning how to kind of relax and soothe themselves back to sleep with these
Yeah.
skills that they'll need as they grow older.
Yeah. And I think like especially like you said, like the accessibility and marketing probably encourages its use and it's probably beneficial for like the producers, like the whoever's like making the melatonin too, in order for like people to continue buying it. So I guess
It's a
that's
very big industry. I mean, I
yeah.
don't want to completely demonize it.
Right,
There
right,
is
right. Yeah.
in children in particular with autism or ADHD.
Yeah, I'm actually doing research about like autism and sleep like connections with it. So, and the person I'm working with, the professor, he regularly prescribes melatonin to his patients. So we were actually talking about that. So,
Yeah, so definitely, like there are appropriate uses for it. It can be
yeah,
really helpful at school. I think the concern is we found that about 50% of parents didn't even talk to any kind of healthcare professional before they
yeah,
decided to give their kid melatonin.
yeah,
And so the big concern is, talk to your doctor about different options, looking into different behavioral strategies to use with melatonin and not just kind of turning to it as a first line of defense.
yeah. So, for my next question, I wanted to go like maybe a little bit like beyond light and screens. Are there any other like factors maybe that you can think of that your research or like that you've researched that have like an influence or an impact on children's circadian systems?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'd say my work mainly focuses on light exposure, but
Okay.
something else that we've started to look into, and that's just growing in the sleep field more broadly, is the idea of regular sleep timing. So
Yeah.
everything for decades has been about the need for enough sleep. Duration of sleep is
Yeah,
what
I was
matters.
actually gonna ask. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and so we're finding now that sleep regularity, so going to bed and waking up at the same times of day, it's kind of related to light exposure. So you're getting consistent light exposure, you're
right.
giving the circadian system cues at the same time of day,
Yeah,
maybe even more important than sleep duration for sleep health and a bunch of outcomes. And there's a metric called social jet lag, which is basically the
yeah,
idea that your sleep timing on weekends differs from your sleep timing on weekdays, or free days versus scheduled days, depending on
yeah,
what kind of job someone has. And recent data that we've put out is finding that it exists in children as young as 2. So even before going to school, even before they pick their own bedtimes, that there's this drift in the sleep schedules of children as young as 2 years old because of the parents'
wow.
schedule, anything else. And that can even be associated with sleep problems. We found it's related to BMI. And so kind of the concern of not just getting enough sleep, getting consistent, regular sleep, even from an early age.
Yeah. That's actually a big thing with me as a high schooler and my friends. And I talk about this too a lot, like where we try to catch up with sleep on the weekends. So it's kind of like we have to be a little smart with like not oversleeping and then just messing our like sleep inertia up or like just staying sleep deprived and not ever getting that sleep because it inevitably does catch up to you when you least expect it.
I
So
was the
I've taken
worst
some very
sleeper
long
in high
naps
school.
because of it.
Yeah, I was a terrible sleeper. Now, like I didn't know any of this. None of this was out when I was in high school. My
Right.
sleep
Yeah.
was 30, and now looking back, I just, what did I what
Yeah.
long-term effects did I do?
Yeah. So my next question is more of like a fun one. And I feel like you're gonna have a good answer because of your like ties with light exposure research. But if you could change one thing about the campus at University of Arizona to better align with lighting or just sleep in general, it can be like a policy or like just a physical like building or like some sort of architectural thing. What is one change you would make there on the campus?
Probably windows. I mean, so
Okay.
I mostly only see my own building, which is kind of in the hospital, and
Yeah.
I'm lucky to have a window, even though it's pretty dirty window and it looks over into like an industrial courtyard. There's no view out it, but at least I
Yeah.
get some natural light. whereas several other people on our department who are sleep and lighting researchers don't even have a window. And
Wow.
so, yeah,
That's kind of ironic, I guess.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's unfortunate. You know, it's an old building, so there's only so many rooms. But just being able to give those, architecture is thankfully starting to pay attention to this. There are some architectural researchers who are working with sleep and lighting
Yeah.
researchers, but trying to be deliberate about that. And so if you can't give windows to get that natural daylight, making it brighter and not even the fancy ones that kind of change throughout the day, but just being able to give people a little bit more control and an opportunity to get that light exposure, even if they have to be indoors all day.
Yeah. My Latin classroom at my high school is actually like it's buried deep inside the middle of the school. And I've noticed that I think kids tend to be a little like sleepier in that class just 'cause like it's the morning and it just feels like dimmer and darker in there. So,
Yeah. And that's obviously, there's not a lot of money to redesign the full
right,
architecture of the
yeah.
building and put a lot of
Inevitably
windows
there's going to
in,
be like some
but
place, but
yeah,
yeah.
or even just giving people the opportunity to bring in lamps and kind of improve
Oh
their
yeah.
light
Yeah.
situation. Or
So,
outdoor spaces that they could easily
yeah,
reach.
yeah, we do actually have some. We actually go outdoors every once in a while because of that. So,
Mhm.
yeah. So looking ahead, what questions about sleep in children are you excited to continue exploring or researching?
It's tough because we know so little in terms of, the circadian aspects and light exposure that I do. And so I feel like I could kind of do anything.
Yeah.
And so even one thing that I'm hoping to do next, which I mentioned, is that the idea of more light exposure during the day, making them less sensitive to light at night. So we found that little children are so sensitive to light at night, much more than adults would be, partly because their pupils are larger and their lenses of their eyes are clear, so just more light gets in.
Oh, okay. I see.
And so presumably getting enough light during the day would help counteract that, but we don't know. And so just kind of getting a better idea of, what does normal light exposure look like in children? What are they actually getting? And then what recommendations can we actually give based on the evidence we have, which is still so minor, to really find useful strategies and effective strategies and feasible strategies that parents and schools can implement to kind of help with young children's sleep.
Yeah. And then for my final question, I just wanted to continue this like futuristic outlook. Do you think like I know you kind of touched on this a little bit with the architectural like designers working with sleep scientists and researchers, but over the next like 5 to 10 years, do you see like more attention to light exposure being like applied in different like scenarios? Like, and I know we've talked about windows, but are there any like other kind of like similar applications just for like sleep awareness in general?
Yeah, there's some cool stuff that's going on. I mean, not even just sleep. There's some interesting work showing that which direction a hospital room faces
Oh
affects
wow.
how quickly people recover. So, like a
Interesting.
southwest facing or southeast facing has more morning light, whereas northwest facing would have more afternoon evening light, which would be dimmer. And they found that
Okay.
that actually influences recovery time.
Wow. I never
There's
thought
a
about that.
cool research where they put a special lighting set into the space station and then looking at the astronauts' sleep and circadian rhythms because they're in such
Oh,
a different environment.
yeah.
So, like thinking about the military and submarines and people who wouldn't necessarily have a normal light dark cycle.
Yeah.
So, just these kind of cool applications. But
Yeah.
it's great that it's just kind of getting more attention, just, more outside of researchers, people are starting hearing about this a little bit more and starting thinking about the importance of getting light exposure for
Yeah.
sleep. Instead of getting it out into the public awareness is growing, which is great.
Yeah, that's really cool. And it's funny that you mentioned the submarine example. I was at a VA hackathon a couple weeks ago, and someone was talking about how I was talking about sleep at some point, and someone was talking about how like when they were on their submarine, they had like 18-hour like days. So I think I'm not sure exactly what the schedule was, but it was like 6 hours working, 6 hours sleeping. I think something like that. But yeah, it was interesting. But yeah, I think yeah, there's
Yeah, so there's a lot
always
of
super cool
shift work and
applications.
people who live in these different kind of environments and different schedules. So how can we make life a little
Yeah,
healthier, more comfortable for them as well?
yeah. So on that note, thank you so much for joining me today. I think we had a really great conversation, and I really like the interesting applications you put out there. I'm definitely going to be thinking about that direction stuff. I never even considered that. So
Yeah,
yeah,
thank you so much.
yeah.